Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Criminolly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, horror, I've got 10 short horror novels that had a lasting effect on me. So I've read a lot of horror novels over the last 35 years or so. I don't know how many exactly, but certainly hundreds. And most of the time, as with most horror fans, I suspect, I read them for fun. I read them, I enjoy them. They might move me, they might frighten me while I'm reading them, whatever. But when I've closed the book at the end and put it down, I put the book away. It doesn't linger with me. It's an enjoyable, scary ride while I'm reading it, but afterwards I can think of other things again. Every so often, though, I read a book and it stays with me. Even if I maybe don't want it to, because it's freaked me out in some way, it lingers with me. So today I wanted to talk about 10 books that have done that. And I've also focused in particular on shorter books. So I'm a big fan of shorter books. I did a video quite recently about, are books too long? And there's certainly a place for long books, and there are many long books that I love. But I also think there's something rather wonderful about a book that manages to pack all of its power into a relatively short number of pages, or a relatively few pages. So all the books I'm going to talk about today are, I think, and I haven't double checked all of them, but I think they are all between about 150 and 300 pages. So all on the shorter side when you consider the mammoths that people like Stephen King sometimes put out. The other thing that occurred to me after I'd finished putting together this list is that the vast majority of these books are books that were written fairly early on in the career of the writer who wrote them. And I'm not sure why that is. I'm not sure if there's something about the process of writing and growing confidence as a writer that means the more you write, the longer your books get. But that certainly seems to be a thing with many writers, that their books just get longer and longer and longer as they go. I also wonder if there's something about the raw passion of someone who is a fairly new writer that means that they really pack a punch in their books. And sometimes I wonder if the more someone writes, the more they kind of second guess themselves, because a lot of the books I'm going to talk about today are books that I would say are quite raw. There's something unguarded about them that I think gives them a real extra impact. Okay, let's go. And these are in no particular order. I haven't listed them in like date order, and they're certainly not listed in order of how highly I rate them. I deliberately didn't do that because these books are all very different from each other. So they're all short horror books, but they cover a really wide range of different styles of horror. In my opinion, anyway. Feel free to disagree. So yeah, there is no ranking to these. I'm going to go through them in the order that I made a note of them, and you can let me know in the comments if there are some that you think are significantly better than others. I did think though that I would start with the King, so I'm going to start with Stephen King, of course. Now, people often ask me what Stephen King book should I start with? So, people who haven't read King and know that I've read a number of his books, and most of his books, often ask me that question. And the answer I invariably give is Carrie. And I think there's two reasons for that, or actually three reasons for that. So one is it was King's first published novel, so it kind of makes sense to start there. The second one is it's short. So unlike many of his books, it's not a book that you're going to be stuck with for ages if you don't like it. And thirdly, I think it really encapsulates a lot of his key themes. So there's a lot in there about kind of coming of age. There's a lot in there about bullying. There's a lot in there about religion. And these are all themes that crop up again and again and again in Stephen King's work. So I think it's a really good, first read for someone who is new to Stephen King, and it's a great story as well. You'll know the story, no doubt, from the film, even if you haven't read the book. But it's about a girl, Carrie White, who has psychic powers. She can move things with her mind, and gets terribly bullied at school, and then takes her revenge on her classmates. And it's a fantastically enjoyable horror ride. But the thing that has always really stuck with me about it is that that representation of bullying. There is something about Carrie's helplessness, or apparent helplessness, at the hands of her classmates, and in particular the kind of the trick they play on her that progresses further and further as the book goes on. And I won't spoil it, say what it is in case you haven't read it. There's something about that that's so cruel and horrible that it has really stuck with me since I read the book, and I read it many years ago. So yeah, that's number one on my list of horror novels that have had a real impact on me is Carrie. The second one is one I've read a lot more recently, and that is Off Season by Jack Ketchum. So this is another book of a similar-ish vintage to Carrie. So Carrie came out, I think, in 1974. Off Season came out in 1981. And the initial edition of Off Season that was published was actually quite heavily censored by the publisher. Later, Leisure Books published an uncensored edition, which is the one that I've read. So Off Season, like many of Stephen King's books, is set in Maine, and is about basically a large, I think they're kind of a family, but more than a family because there's loads of them, kind of tribe of cannibals living in backwoods Maine who attack a group of city dwellers who have come to stay in a cabin there. So it's real classic kind of 70s, 80s stuff. There was a lot of stuff like this in the 70s and 80s about the clash between urban and rural. The many films like Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a great example of that. And it seems to me to be a consistent theme in American, not just horror, but in other forms of American entertainment. This clash between small town, rural America and the city. So, a great example, very different indeed from Off Season, from recent years is the TV show Schitt's Creek, which is, about exactly that. It's that culture clash thing. Now in Off Season, it's not just that the rural folks, don't get on with the city dwellers. They actually, slaughter and sexually assault and eat them. So it's a very gritty and grimy and horrible book. And the thing that is so impactful about it, and this is something that is not, certainly not original to Off Season, but Jack Ketchum does it brilliantly, is that feeling that in order to survive, the supposedly civilized city dwellers have to get increasingly brutal and violent. So this again is, it's a theme that comes up a lot in horror, but I think Ketchum does it fantastically in Off Season. So by the end, the levels of violence that are being meted out, both by the cannibals and by the city dwellers and by the local police, is just off the charts, and you end the book feeling worn out by all of the violence. So often in cheaper, less effective horror, should we say, the violence is kind of almost titillating, isn't it? It's there as part of the entertainment. In a lot of slasher movies and things like that. In Off Season, the violence, it feels real. It's absolutely horrific. So yeah, again, a very impactful book. Next up, another book I've talked about recently on the channel, Wasp Factory by Ian Banks. So like Carrie, I first read this when I was a teenager, and it's one of those books that has just stuck with me over the decades. So this is a Scottish horror novel about a young guy called Frank, who is growing up on a kind of remote Scottish island, living alone with his father, and his father is absolutely bonkers. So living in a very strange environment, and his older brother is someone who's been incarcerated for like violent crimes and is insane, and he's now been released and is coming back, and there are these constant phone calls between the two of them as the brother gets closer and closer to Frank, and as the story develops, you also learn more about violent acts in Frank's past. So it's a very weird but effective novel about violence and about our capacity for violence as humans, but also just about the way that people's minds can be broken by their environment, and by the environment they grow up in. So yeah, another very effective book, grimly amusing in places in a way that Off Season certainly isn't. It's almost a black comedy, but one I think with a real message at the heart of it. Next up, another British horror novel. I think this one probably is technically a novella rather than a novel. And that is The Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker. So from the, I think, mid-80s, and very famously filmed as Hellraiser with Clive Barker as screenwriter and director. This is just a beautifully written and very effective book about obsession and about our desires, our innermost desires, and the things we will do to get what we want. So if you've seen the film, you'll know that it's about this guy who's kind of a pleasure seeker, who's constantly looking for the next thrill, who gets more than he bargained for when he finds this mysterious puzzle box and calls these creatures called the Cenobites from another realm. So I won't go into more than that for fear of spoiling it for you if you've not seen the movie or read the book. But as I say, it's a very, very effective tale of the lengths people will go to get the things they think they want. And I think what's really effective about it is the brevity of Clive Barker's descriptions of things. So there's a lot of parts in the book where he hints at things rather than actually showing them, and he tells you just enough that you can make that a bit of a picture in your mind and fill in the blanks yourself without telling you all of it. And that, I think, is a really effective way of doing horror, and it certainly works brilliantly in The Hellbound Heart. Completely different then for the next book. This is Deadhead by Sean Hudson. So if you've watched the channel for any length of time, you will know that I like Sean Hudson. Deadhead is a kind of mid-period Sean Hudson, I guess, or it's so after his initial stuff, which tended to be very over the top and quite kind of silly in its gore almost. So things like his first book, Slugs, which is about killer slugs. You can tell from that the kind of book you're going to get. So so later in his career, he moved much more into writing what is almost crime. So it's still definitely horror, but it feels at times more like crime fiction. And Deadhead is one of those very gritty kind of books that he writes, which is about a guy who is investigating the disappearances of some teenagers, and whose daughter gets kidnapped by the people who are responsible for those disappearances. And it is incredibly gritty and horrible in places. There are some scenes in that book of violence against teenagers, basically, which are some of the most horrific and horrifying things I've ever read. And there's a narrative power to it. So Hudson is, and I think considers himself to be a something of a trashy writer. And books like Slugs, definitely play up to that. But there's a real power to his writing as well. He has a real ability to tell a story and just to keep that narrative, barreling along. And he really does that in Deadhead. But he intersperses it with these absolutely horrific scenes. Nobody is safe in Deadhead. And by the end of it, a great number of people have died in very horrible ways. But another very effective book. Okay, so next up from 1963 is The Collector by John Fowles, which again is a book I read many years ago. So I read this as a teenager, and it's again a book that has just stuck with me. So it's about a young guy who is very kind of strange and withdrawn, who becomes obsessed with a girl. So the young guy collects butterflies and displays butterflies, and he becomes obsessed with this woman and kidnaps her in the belief that she will eventually fall in love with him. And it's about that kidnapping and her imprisonment and their relationship. And it's just like some of the other books I've mentioned, it's just a wonderful and chilling examination of a broken human mind. So a fantastic book. Next up is The Loney by Andrew Michael Hurley, which is something a bit more recent. So this is one of those horror books with such a fantastic sense of place that you really feel like you're there. So it's set in this strange town that's surrounded by kind of marshland, and it's about these two brothers who go there with their family and the kind of mysterious things that happen there. And it's one of those books, a bit like The Hellbound Heart, that kind of hints at things and lets you draw your own conclusions. There's large parts of the book that are, kind of the one of the brothers looking back on what happened and trying to figure out for himself what went on. So there are many parts of it that are, and I think this is something that can be done particularly effectively in horror, is where one of the characters doesn't really quite know what happened, and you go on that journey with them to try and piece the bits together, and that can be, in the right hands, something that's extremely chilling, and it certainly is in The Lonely. Okay, next up is Fever Dream by Samantha Schweblin, who's an Argentine author. So this was originally published in Spanish and then translated into English. And this is one of those books that just feels like a nightmare, in the best possible way. So it's about a young boy and a woman who are in hospital, and you don't really ever know in the book what's going on. So you know that the boy is infected with some strange disease, but you never really find out how he got it. You know that something terrible is going on outside, but you never really grasp, exactly what. There is some sort of strange animal-borne disease out there, I think. And yeah, it's just completely nightmarish, and you get these characters telling each other, their stories about what's happened to them, and you never really know whether you believe them or not. And it just, the whole thing has that kind of wonderful dreamlike feeling that kind of great fantastic fiction sometimes has, that just sticks with you. And I found that it was a book that just kept on playing at my mind after I'd finished it, as I tried to figure out what was really going on in it. And that might sound like a criticism in some ways. Some people will find themselves frustrated by books where they finish it and there are still unanswered questions. But I think when it's done well, it can be a really effective technique in horror. Okay, next up is Dear Laura by Gemma Amor, which is an absolutely fantastic independently published short novel about this woman Laura, who every year receives a letter on her birthday from this mysterious stranger, and the letters get creepier and creepier as the years progress. So it starts when she's a teenager, and a friend of hers goes missing at that time, and there seems to be some connection between the sender of the letters and the missing person, and it just builds and builds and builds over time. So it's about the effect that kind of obsessive stalking has on her, and also how she comes to terms with it, but how she takes ownership of it, I guess. It's really, really creepy, but also enormously involving and satisfying in terms of the strength that you see within Laura as the story progresses. So another fantastic book that really stuck with me over the years. And then finally, the most recent book in this list, You've Lost a Lot of Blood by Eric LaRocca, which was published just a couple of months ago. So this is a really interesting and a kind of deeply layered story about a guy called Marta Black, who is a psychotic. So it's about him and his relationship with his boyfriend, who kind of becomes an accomplice of his as they kidnap and torture other young men. But it's also, and more than that, it's about like the inside of his mind, I guess. So you get within it a number of different artifacts, I suppose, that help you piece things together. So you get recordings of conversations between him and his boyfriend. You get letters that he's written, and like diary entries and that kind of thing. And you also get within it this novella, which is also called You've Lost a Lot of Blood, that he's written, which is a kind of weird pulpy tale about this young woman who's a video game designer who goes to work in this remote location for this eccentric kind of video game genius. It's a very weird book, but very effective as well, and you really feel like you are being given the pieces to put together for you as the reader to figure out both what's happened, but also why Marta Black's brain is as damaged, or his psyche is as damaged as it is. So yeah, another fascinating read, and one that really chilled me when I was reading it. So that's my list of 10 short horror novels that had a real impact on me. Do let me know in the comments if you've read any of them. Let me know what you thought of the list. Let me know if there's books you think I should be adding to it. But yeah, as always, hope you found that interesting. Hope you're reading good stuff, and I will speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.